In John chapter 13, Jesus washes the feet of his disciples. And there's a hidden, deeper meaning that a lot of people miss when they read this passage of scripture. What if I told you that this story actually has to do with what Jesus intends to do in the future from the vantage point of this event? This revelation honestly blew my mind and left me in awe, and I pray it opens your eyes as well. So let's jump into John chapter 13 and see what Jesus is really doing in this story. So here in John 13 is where Jesus washes the feet of his disciples. But before we read this story, there's some background information that you need to know in Philippians chapter 2. And this is what blew my mind when I understood the connection that was being made here when Jesus washes the feet of his disciples. This is what Philippians chapter 2 says about Jesus coming into the world and accomplishing our salvation. It says, "Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interests of others." Now, this is very important. This is not just background information. This is foundational to the actual story that takes place when Jesus washes the feet of his disciples. So he says, look not only to your own interest, but also to the interests of others. This is very key. Verse 5, it says, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, even though he was in the form of God, didn't count equality with God a thing to be grasped." Now, this is very important. There's a mind that the Apostle Paul is encouraging the believers to have, and it's this mind. Jesus had us operated by a specific mentality, a way of thinking, even though he was in the form of God. So this is the assumption. This is the foundational understanding we're working from, is that Jesus indeed was in the form of God. In other words, he is divine. He truly is the eternal word emanating from the Father, right? So he is equally God alongside the Father. But even though that was true, he didn't count equality with God a thing to be grasped. Now, this phrase right here, equality with God, and the fact that he says Jesus didn't consider it a thing to be grasped, leaves people thinking that Jesus was not equal with God. That's not what Paul is saying. He's saying his equality with God the Father here. And you go, well, you're adding the Father. Well, we're talking about the Son. So obviously the God that's being referred to here is the Father, because Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus here isn't not equal with God. He is. He just said, hey, this equality that I have with God is not something that I'm going to grasp onto. And what does it mean that Jesus didn't grasp onto or cling to this equality with God? Well, here's what verse 7 tells us. He emptied himself by taking the form of a servant. Now, this is very important, because what we see in John 13 is Jesus is taking on this role of serving, washing the feet of his disciples, okay? He empties himself, right? So whatever it means that he's in the form of a servant, right? In that same degree, he's in the form of God. But this being equal with God, having divine essence, right? Being divine himself, he didn't cling to or grasp onto this equality with God, but instead, here's what he does. He empties himself. How? Did he stop being God? Did he stop being equal with God? No, well, no. He took on the form of a servant. He adds to his divinity something new. And what is it that he does? Well, he is being born in the likeness of men. Now, you might wonder why I'm using certain colors to highlight certain things. For no specific reason, just that I want to highlight this. Jesus is born in the likeness of men. He's 100% humanity. Everything that the human condition has to offer, he takes on, all the way to the point of death. This is very important. This is what it means that Jesus doesn't grasp onto or cling to his equality with God, even though he's in the form of God. This is very important. The form isn't just referring to outwards, appearance, but actual substance and nature and essence. And being found in human form, he humbled himself. Now, I'm just going to highlight in yellow this idea of humbling himself, because that's what it looks like for him to empty himself or take on the form of a servant, right? Emptying himself, serving to the point that he humbles himself to the point of death. This is what Paul has in mind here, and this very much relates to John 13. By becoming obedient to the point of let me show you what he subjects himself to the point of death, even death on a cross. So what does Jesus do instead of clinging to his equality with God and staying in heaven, remaining in glory what does he do? Well, he adds humanity to divinity. He takes on the form and the likeness of humanity, comes as one of us, but not just that. He doesn't just come down from heaven to be one of us. He actually humbles himself so much that he obeys the Father to the point of dying a gruesome death on a cross. So there's layers of humility. There's layers of service. There's layers of Jesus emptying himself. He doesn't come as a conquering king, luxurious riches and comfort. He comes in the form of a servant. And he takes on the lowest form that a human being can take on, which is the humiliating, death on a cross and being condemned and shamed and mocked and scorned. All of this, I promise, relates to John 13 when we get there. Therefore, God has highly exalted him. So what does the Father do in response to the Son's obedience and humility and service and taking on the likeness of men? What does the Father do? He exalts the Son. How so? What I'm going to do is highlight anything relating to exaltation in this color. He exalts him, and he bestows on him the name that is above every name. What does that mean? Well, what we're going to see in the verse that follows is that, so, he says, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow. So this refers to authority. This refers to dominion. This refers to power. This refers to supremacy. The actual name of Jesus being the substance of who he is, even the reputation that accompanies that name, not just the assembling of the letters, but the sum total of who Jesus is as the perfect one who came in the likeness of men and took on human form and died our death. That Jesus who saves humanity and humbled himself by leaving his glory in heaven, that name is the name at which every single knee will bow, in heaven and on the earth and under the earth. And every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So I want you to notice two things here, and you probably know where I'm going by now. Jesus doesn't stop being God. He doesn't lay aside his divinity. He doesn't lay aside his deity. What he does is he adds the human nature to his already pre-existing divine form. In other words, the eternal word, like John's gospel tells us, he takes on human flesh and he comes into our world, already pre-existing this human form he takes on. This is Jesus serving. He lays aside his glory. He leaves all the worship and glory that he's had, all the divine entitlements he has as being God alongside the Father. He lays all of that aside, leaves it behind in heaven, and humbles himself to the point of death, to the point of obeying the Father, even if it meant being crucified on a cross to save humanity. So Jesus lays something aside, right? Doesn't cling to or grasp onto his equality with God, right? He lays it aside in terms of his glory and all the worship and divine entitlements he has, and he actually becomes dependent on the Father as any other human being would. Subjects himself to all that the likeness of humanity has to offer. Sickness, disease, tiredness, exhaustion, hunger, thirst, temptation, all that stuff. He's a human just like one of us. Now, in response to that, what God does is he exalts the Son in his humanity, raises him from the dead, and bestows on him the name at which every knee in heaven and earth and under the earth will bow to. In other words, the authority, the supremacy, it's not just that Jesus is restored to the place where he left, but as the first resurrected human from the dead, he's actually given the name that extends salvation and forgiveness to humanity. This is on our behalf. This is not for Jesus' sake. This is for our sake, that he has the name above every name as the ultimate supreme king and ruler of the universe. But he gains back what Adam and Eve forfeited in the garden. So notice the giving up and not grasping to something, and then the adding on, not just what he laid aside, but in a new dimension, his human nature is raised from the dead to be the human one that represents all of us before the Father, all these different ideas. Now, you're probably wondering why I went to Philippians chapter 2. Well, because in John 13, there's something absolutely incredible that people miss. They think this is just Jesus, showing how much of a servant he is. It is far more than that. And I think this event actually captures the very heart of the gospel. So when we get to John chapter 13, sorry, it's right here. When Jesus washes the feet of his disciples, there's a couple things that you need to know as we enter into this text. And it's very important that you catch this in the previous chapter. When Jesus says, in verse 44 and 45, Jesus cried out and said, "Whoever believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me." Jesus wants people to know that he's been sent by someone. And part of believing in him is admitting and trusting in the fact that he is indeed sent by the Father, approved of by the Father, and the Father has validated him to be the one who represents humanity before the Father on our behalf. Verse 45, "Whoever sees me sees him who sent me." So there seems to be an emphasis on the fact that Jesus is sent. Remember, Philippians 2 tells us he didn't cling to his equality with God. He actually let go of his divine entitlements to take on human flesh and suffer in our place. He says, "I have come into the world as light, so that whoever believes in me may not remain in the darkness." Okay, so this is the idea as we transition to Jesus, as we enter into the story of Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. The emphasis is on the fact that he's been sent, he's come into the world, and he's bringing what only God can bring himself to humanity, to bridge the gap between God and man. Only God can do that as one of us. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart, so now we don't just see Jesus being sent or coming into the world, it's the departing out of the world that is emphasized here in chapter 13. So hold those two ideas in mind as you look at this, okay? Jesus coming into the world and Jesus departing. Both those ideas are going to be key to this text. He said he's departing out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world. He loved them to the end. I just want to emphasize this, loving those who believed in him all the way to the end. Now, it says, during supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, now watch, this is where we get into the good stuff, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, right? So this is what I want to emphasize here in yellow, that the Father has given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God. I'm going to highlight this in yellow, right? The coming, the being sent, and was going back to God. These three ideas are going to be important as it frames up what Jesus is doing here. And if you don't pay attention to these key ideas, you miss it. He rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments. Okay, so I just want to highlight this in salmon, that he laid aside his what? His outer garments. Okay, just think about that. And taking a towel, he tied it around his waist. In other words, he puts on this towel, ties it around his waist in order to serve and wash the feet of his disciples. That's why this towel is put on him, to serve and to benefit and to wash the disciples. Okay. Then he poured water into a basin. I'm just going to circle this idea of water and washing because I want you to see it. He poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. So notice the emphasis. Again, this is not just some random detail. The towel that's wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" Notice the emphasis on washing and cleansing. Jesus answered him, "What I'm doing, you don't understand now, but afterward you will understand." And Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." Like, you will never stoop that low and do something so lowly. And remember when John the Baptist said, "I'm not even worthy of untying the sandals of Jesus." And now Peter's going, "You should not be washing our feet, Lord. There's no way. You're the king." And Jesus answered, "Well, if I don't wash you, you have no share with me." Now remember, what did he say? That the Father, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, that he had come from God and was going back to God. those three ideas relate to what it means that Peter won't have, or this is what it means for Peter to have a share with Jesus. Those ideas are involved. Okay. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. In other words, give me a bath, wash me entirely. And Jesus said to him, well, the one who is bathed doesn't need to wash. Let me circle that idea again. Except for his feet, but is completely clean. The idea of being cleaned and washed. And you are clean. He says this in John 15. But not every one of you, for he knew who was to betray him. That was why he said not all of you are clean. He's referring to Judas, right? The one who's going to betray him. Now watch, when he had washed, when this was finished, right here, when he was done washing their feet, which is symbolic of what he's doing in the earth for humanity, right? He put on his what? Well, I highlighted it in salmon earlier. I'll be consistent. He put on his outer garments, right? And what did he do? He resumed his place. And he said to them, do you understand what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, humbled myself, served you in the lowliest kind of way, in even a humiliating kind of way, which is going to be symbolic of him going to the cross and serving in that capacity, right? You also ought to wash one another's feet. I've given you an example that you should also do just as I've done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now, you can go on and read this, but here's what I want to emphasize, and here's why I started with Philippians 2. In Philippians 2, it's very evident that Jesus actually lays aside all the divine entitlements he has, all the glory he has in heaven, all the worship, he lays it aside. His divine form, he doesn't cling to that. Instead, what he does is he takes on human flesh and he comes to serve. In other words, in order for Jesus to wash and cleanse humanity of sin, he has to become one of us to effectively do that and represent us before the Father. Now, I want you to notice these ideas. All things are given into the hands of Jesus, which is to say he's capable of saving and redeeming and extending forgiveness to the uttermost because he's going to accomplish our salvation on the cross. He's come from God and he's going back to God, right? So that's why I said Jesus coming from God, laying aside all the divine entitlements, all the glory, all the worship he has. That's the idea that's being symbolically represented in Jesus laying aside his outer garments. And then he knew that he was going back to God, right? And part of that is going to involve, the Father exalting the Son to his right hand, where Jesus is our high priest and represents us and establishes a new covenant and all these different ideas that are based on Jesus going back to the Father, right? But part of Jesus laying aside his outer garments, which is symbolic of Jesus actually, laying aside his divine entitlements and his glory and worship. Part of that involves taking a towel, tying it around his waist, which is symbolic of Jesus what? Taking on humanity, taking on the human condition, taking on, binding himself to the human nature and becoming one of us. That's what Philippians 2 said. He was found in human form. He took on humanity. He came in the likeness of man. He was born of the Virgin Mary at the incarnation. He was born of the woman. He takes on our human nature and condition to represent us. But in order for that to happen, so this is what it means for Jesus to lay aside all the glory and worship and divine entitlements he has, is he adds human nature to his own divinity. He doesn't have to. He chooses to in order to serve us, which is what is symbolically represented here in Jesus pouring water and washing the feet of his disciples with what? With the towel that was wrapped around him, which we've already established. I do believe that the towel symbolically represents Jesus wrapping himself in humanity. And by representing us and taking our death and paying our debt on the cross as one of us, he is essentially cleansing us through that human nature he's taken on himself. Because Romans 8 tells us that in the flesh of Jesus, sin was condemned. And this towel, I believe, represents the human nature Jesus wraps himself in by becoming one of us, But then what we see at the end of this story, Jesus washing, and there's so many things we could break down. Let me know in the comments if you want me to break this down even further in a future video, but we're running out of time. It says, when he had washed their feet, which I believe the washing here is symbolic, at least to a degree of cleansing of sin, because he tells Peter, you're already cleansed, you're already clean, but this refers to the, whatever it is that the disciples, walk around in the world and end up, getting themselves caught up in. Either way, Jesus is washing them, cleansing them, which spiritually is what he does to his bride, his people. He washes and cleanses us of all sin spiritually so that we're free of all guilt and condemnation and all that stuff. So if that's the case, and Jesus accomplished our salvation, accomplished our cleansing, accomplished our, spiritual redemption for us to be forgiven and cleansed and have a new heart, then what Jesus does here by putting on his outer garments and resuming his place is going to symbolically represent Jesus, assuming his rightful place that he left in glory in heaven at the right hand of the Father, and he put on his outer garments, which is to take back on the glory and the worship and the divine entitlements that he laid aside to come down and serve and wash and cleanse humanity through his own sacrifice. This has the atonement and the gospel and salvation written all over it. This is Jesus leaving heaven, and he's not just washing their feet to go, look how nice I am. He's resuming his place afterward to make a case that when Jesus finishes cleansing and washing his people fully to the uttermost, like Hebrews tells us, he assumes his place at the right hand of the Father to note that it is finished. So everything in this little story is symbolically representing the entire work of Jesus when he comes into our world, lays aside his glory and worship and divine entitlements, comes into our world to be one of us, to wash and cleanse us, accomplish our salvation, and then he resumes his place at the right hand of the Father as our perfect representative and mediator. There's so much more we could break down, but I hope now you see the absolute beauty in this story. It is that Jesus serves, but it's to the degree that we can't even fathom what he's done. Like the kind of service, the kind of humility that Jesus does and accomplishes and shows us in this is incredible. So listen, if you want to learn how to read the Bible and study the Bible and go deeper into the scriptures, maybe you're bored, frustrated, whatever it may be, go ahead and take our free 40-day Bible study program linked in the description below. It's completely free, it's online, and it's self-paced. Go check it out. Or visit abovereproachministry.com. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you haven't already subscribed, go ahead and do that and hit the bell so you can be notified of any future videos that come out. And check out abovereproachministry.com. We have completely free Bible study courses, a 40-day program, a 27-day, and 11-day program, all kinds of free resources. You can get a copy of my book. You can join our online church. You can get some merch. We have a bunch of stuff at abovereproachministry.com. And it's also linked in the description below. Go check that out. And thanks for watching.